Thank you so much, Jane and Elaine. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm just honored and delighted to be speaking to you today. So I'm going to be sharing my screen here so that you can see the slide presentation here. And so while I'm showing these images, I won't be able to see the chat window. So please do speak up, and I'll try to pause at some point and check the chat window. And certainly at the end of the lecture, I'm happy to look at all the questions and go through them. So we're looking at a Monet. It was exhibited in the first Impressionist exhibition. Is everyone seeing the images okay? Great.
Yep.
It's called Impression Sunrise. It's the painting from which the movement Impressionism gets its name. A critic was really shocked by how sketch-like the painting is, and by sketch-like, I mean by 19th century terms, it looked unfinished. And so he referred to it derisively as, you know, only a sketch. In fact, he said, this was a critic named Louis Leroy, he said, you know, that a kind of unfinished wallpaper that you were still working on would be more finished than this painting. So Impressionism, you know, we think of it as being very kind of, you know, popular and being very beautiful, when really at the time it was produced, it was new, it was controversial, it was even shocking. So before we look at Impressionism proper, I wanted to start with how modern art becomes shocking. You know, how did we get to a point where an interesting new art movement is something that's different, you know, something that's, you know, kind of against the grain of what people are expecting from art. Okay, why isn't my image advancing? That's strange. Okay, I'm just going to, oh boy, this, you know, I've taught with Zoom for a whole year. This only happened once. There we go. Okay, all right, I figured out how to do it. All right, I hope that doesn't happen again. Okay, so I said Impressionism was against the grain. So what did people in France in the 19th century, what did they expect when they heard the word art? So there was a system of a large exhibition every year or every other year called the Salon. And the Salon was a juried exhibition. It was juried by members of the French Academy. And this was, if you can kind of picture a small art faculty at an elite university, it was something like that, a very small group of people who had been members of the Academy for decades and who tended to kind of vote for the same kind of art that they were familiar with. And so it becomes a very conservative process. And so we're looking at just part of one wall of this immense exhibition in 1852, photographed by a great photographer named Gustave Le Gray. And so these Salon exhibitions have thousands of paintings. I mean, 1852 probably had more than 1,000 and fewer than 2,000 paintings. And it was a big honor to be included. But the paintings, as you see, are floor to ceiling. You know, they would just cram in as many paintings in a room as they could. And so, like, if you had painted that portrait that's up really high and it's a dark painting and you have a visitor who's going there at night, you know, you're not going to be able to see that portrait that's way up high very well. And so artists tried to paint large paintings and you know, submitted them for approval. And by 1863, the approval was getting so strict that only about half of the works submitted were getting approved and accepted into the Salon. And And in 1863, a young artist named Edouard Manet, who is very important to the Impressionists, but he doesn't become an Impressionist. He submits this painting to the Salon of 1863, Luncheon on the Grass, or Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. This painting is shocking in many ways. First of all, it represents contemporary life. You know, we're not looking at history, which was a more acceptable mode of painting in the 19th century. We're looking at kind of ordinary people, but what are they doing? Manet initially called it bathing, and there is a woman bathing in the background, but there are two fully clothed men there, and the men look like students. Again, they don't dress the way college students dress nowadays, but viewers interpreted them as college students. And you have this fully nude woman next to the two men. So this painting was rejected from the Salon, not surprisingly. It has this shocking subject matter, and it's painted in this very bold manner where the nude body of the woman really stands out against the background. And the background is painted in a fairly sketch-like way. It's not like Impressionism, but it is fairly bold by 19th century standards. That year, there was such an outcry about the number of works rejected from the Salon that the fine arts minister decided to allow the rejected artists to have their own exhibition. So it was called the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Rejected Artists. You didn't have to exhibit there if you got rejected. You know, like maybe if you wrote a paper and you got an F on it, you wouldn't want to share it with the class and say, here, read my paper that I got an F on. But if you're an artist and you have a chance to exhibit, even if the exhibition is called Rejected Works, that's a lot of publicity, and there's even something a little bit kind of exciting about, like, why did these paintings get rejected? And Manet recognized that it's actually kind of a cool opportunity to exhibit. So he exhibits this painting at the Salon des Refusés. Art historians have mostly considered the ways in which Manet's painting reinterprets some old master paintings, some paintings from the Renaissance, like this painting, which is a Venetian Renaissance painting that was hanging in the Louvre. But of course, in this painting, the two nude women appear more to be muses or allegorical figures. They don't appear to be modern figures alongside the men. And Manet has, in fact, adapted the composition of a work that he knew from a print. It was actually supposed to be turned into a tapestry, but it was, in Manet's time, just a Renaissance print by Marcantonio Raimondi, and it was a copy of a Raphael that no longer exists. So in this print that you see in the upper left here, it's the Judgment of Paris. And so it's a story from Greek mythology where the shepherd Paris is awarding the golden apple to Venus. But off to the right, you see three river gods seated next to the river, kind of reclining, conversing. And so Manet has taken figures who are from his own sort of social world. I mean, it's his brother on the right, it's his future brother-in-law in the center, and then his favorite model, a woman named Victorine Meurent, who appears in many of his early paintings, is the one posing nude. And they're actually even on Manet's own family property, interestingly enough. Well, while art historians have looked at these old master paintings that were a kind of important basis for Manet's composition, I think it's also interesting that in Manet's time, photography is a fairly new art. Photography is really invented in 1839, and so photography in the 1850s is still fairly new. They're still kind of inventing new processes. It's not yet a mass market art. And the stereoscopic photograph is kind of a new phenomenon. And so these are printed very small. They're printed at about not even the scale of this pad of paper, 2 images side by side, and you pop them in a viewer, and then you get a 3D effect when you look at the 2 images together. So there was a burgeoning industry of pornographic nude photographs, along with travel photographs and other kinds of images that typically figured into these stereoscopic photographs. And so you see these 2 models posing nude, and they're just in a photographer's studio here in front of, kind of like a fake piece of scenery, this sort of, stone wall behind them, and then there's painted scenery behind them. But in the stereoscope, these kinds of images then kind of pop and look very 3-dimensional. You see, the difference between looking at a Titian, the Renaissance painting I was showing you, and looking at one of these photographs is that the figures in the Titian painting look very generalized and really idealized, whereas the figures here are individuals. They are particular people who maybe have little idiosyncrasies about, their hair. They're wearing some jewelry, like this woman at right. Manet has painted particular people that we can identify, and that too adds to this immediacy that this painting has. That we're trying to figure out, why are the 2 men not talking to the woman? Why is the woman looking at us? Why is she nude? Why is only one person bathing? If it's supposed to be a scene of bathing, or if it's supposed to be a picnic, why is there bathing and picnicking going on? So the painting is enigmatic, but it's also modern. It's also a kind of modern rethinking of an old master kind of composition. And it has something of the immediacy of the contemporary photograph. So, in fact, I would just make one more point, because I can go backwards. Good. I'll just show you the whole painting again. To me, the kind of source material of the stereoscopic photographs is kind of like an internet meme today. Like, it's one thing to say that this Titian painting is the basis for Manet's painting. It's a painting in the Louvre. But these pornographic photographs are, they're small, they're not high art. No one is taking them seriously as art. They're kind of campy. They're kind of cheesy, let's say. They're not high art. And so for Manet to kind of incorporate some effects that we associate with this low art, it would be kind of like you're borrowing from, or you're quoting from, an internet meme in a work of art that you're producing today. And of course, we might do that. I mean, it's very contemporary to, kind of borrow from things that you see on the internet in works of art today. But that was something very new in Manet's time. So something else going on as Impressionism is getting started is that Paris, which is the center of the art world until World War II, when New York really becomes the center of the art world, is that there's an enormous urban renewal project kind of renovation, gentrification project going on, but quite an enormous one, um, taking place under the directorship of, it's kind of like the mayor of Paris. He's called the prefect of Paris, and his name is Haussmann. Uh, so we're looking at a photograph here in the 1850s as many buildings and residents and tens of thousands of people lived on this island that's in the center of Paris, which is where Notre Dame is and where Sainte-Chapelle is and some other major monuments in Paris. It was the most densely populated part of Paris, but they decided to tear down a lot of old buildings, narrow streets, and build some kind of big government buildings and just new roads, and not just in the Ile de la Cité, but all over Paris, especially in the center. And so what we're seeing is that streets like this one, which are narrow and there's sewage right in the street, and it's hard to have lighting in these, and it's sometimes even hard to drive a carriage down some of these streets. These streets are getting torn down, and Haussmann is building wider avenues and boulevards, usually terminating in a monument. Like the building of the Garnier Opera House is one of the big projects during Haussmann's tenure. So this kind of view of streets that have buildings of uniform height, it's kind of easy to drive down the street, north and south are connected. But this process is also pushing a lot of poor people to the outskirts of the city. Rents are going up, and a lot is kind of torn down and kind of being rebuilt. So again, when we look at the Impressionists' concentration on modernity, it's not only a new subject for art, but it's also at a time when modernity is something fraught. It's something that is kind of being thrust upon people, like, oh, you live in this neighborhood that has this street that's been there since the year 1000 or something. Well, we're tearing it down. We're building this very modern street. So modernity is, it's progress, but it's not comfortable for everyone, especially for people who are struggling. This Caillebotte painting, which is very, very famous, it's in the Art Institute of Chicago. I mean, this is in the third Impressionist exhibition. It's iconic now in terms of Impressionism's concentration on modernity, fashion, but it's also, I think, recording a lot of things that are new about Paris and about Impressionism. We see gas lights, for instance, and in the middle of the 19th century, there's this real expansion of street lighting in Paris. Practically everyone in this painting is carrying an umbrella, and it was actually new to have weather forecasts in the newspaper. Time is being, universal Greenwich Mean Time, universal standards for time are being established because we now have train travel. And so if you say that the train is leaving at 5:05, you better know what 5:05 is, not approximately 5 o'clock or, 4:45 or 5:05. And so these figures who are wearing modern clothes and carrying umbrellas and walking down this new Haussmannian avenue that has these buildings of uniform height, like all of these are really emblems of what is modern, what is new at this moment. Caillebotte's technique is not typical of Impressionism. He goes for a little more finish. And you'll see that as we get into a little more impressionist painting. What is more kind of typical of Impressionism is Monet's art. And I want to show you, how does Monet arrive at this style that we call Impressionism. So I want to start with a painting that's a couple of years before his first Impressionist painting. It's called Terrace or Garden at Saint Adresse. It shows his father's retirement property. His father, Monet is from Le Havre on the Normandy coast, and his father has bought this this property right on the coast. So you're looking right out onto the English Channel. And so that's Monet's father sitting in the chair with the kind of straw hat and the cane at right. You might look at this painting if you were a costume designer for a period drama that was set in 1860s, in France or even in England. There are so many moments of attention to kind of gesture and the length of the man's top hat or Monet's father's straw hat and the parasols that the women are carrying, the dresses that the women are wearing. And that's typical of realism, this movement that comes right before Impressionism that Manet is part of, that, kind of close attention to what are we wearing and, what do ordinary people do? Realism is interested in kind of documenting ordinary life. So Monet is very interested in that, but Monet is also interested in light effects. And I think you'll see that in this painting, Monet's handling of the parasol that's right in the center of the painting, facing us. You see the light hitting the parasol, you see the shadow on the parasol, it's like a big triangle. Or the parasol that's being carried by the woman on the other end of the terrace. It's the sunlight is hitting it, so it's kind of yellowish white, and then it's green underneath, like it's picking up the green from the garden. That's his attention to light effects. And this is a small painting. It's at the Metropolitan Museum, and so it's very crisp, and that interest in simplifying light effects works well. He was at the same time working on a larger Déjeuner sur l'herbe, just like, same title as Manet's painting. He wanted it to be much, much larger. Manet's painting is about 6 feet square. This painting is 14 feet high and 20 feet across. He never finishes it. He cuts it up. There are a couple of versions, there are a couple of studies, and there's a smaller sketch and so forth. But he's having trouble reconciling his very real interest in kind of documenting the costumes and what are people wearing and what kind of picnic are they having. Like, it's a much more sort of splendid picnic than Manet's weird Déjeuner sur l'herbe with just a few fruits and this nude woman. That's kind of a weird picnic. This is a very beautiful picnic, like you would see in a kind of period drama or something. Very lovely, but it's not finished because Monet is trying to simplify the light effects the way he's doing it in this small painting, and it's not really working well in a painting that's 20 feet high. So this sketch shows us his plan for the whole scene. So there were even servants, there were lots of figures. It was going to be a very, very kind of dressed up, fancy picnic. And he never finishes this painting. He's trying to submit paintings to the Salon. He's struggling. He realizes he's not going to have anything ready in time for the Salon of 1870. But in 1869, he's working on a painting, actually several paintings, of an entertainment spot outside Paris called La Grenouillère. This is the place where, people, there's a floating restaurant, you can rent a canoe, you can swim, you can hang out. And so this is an engraving from an illustrated magazine of the time, kind of like the Life magazine at the time. And it shows us what kind of place La Grenouillère is. It also shows how in the 19th century, when people look at a scene, they really expect it to tell a story. They expect lots of detail. We see the man who's kind of helping his girlfriend or sister or someone learn to swim. We see the guy who's smoking a cigarette and getting ready to hop into the water. We see the people who are not going to get into the water, but are going to stand around in their fancy clothes and chit-chat, and so forth. Monet's painting, again, this was not something he exhibited right away. He didn't consider it a finished painting. He considered it a sketch for a larger painting, like the Déjeuner sur l'Herbe, that he was going to do and never did. And it was going to be panoramic. It was going to have another painting that showed more of the floating restaurant, another painting that showed more of the canoes, and this little boardwalk that connected the canoe area with this thing called this camembert. They called it this sort of wheel that you could sit on or dive off of. And so Monet is thinking of this as a kind of panorama of modern leisure, panorama of modern life. And he's doing it in the most sketch-like way possible. He's just kind of using a few brush strokes to show us the man standing on the little camembert wheel wearing white trousers, or the women in 19th century bathing costumes at left. He writes to his friend Basile, here I'm at a loss. I don't have much to show for myself. I only have a few bad sketches. It's kind of just a dream I have of doing a painting of La Grenouillère. He literally calls this painting and the others that he's working on here a few bad sketches. But I think you can see that the way he handles the figures in this painting is very different from the way he handled the figures in the Terrace at Saint-Adresse. The gestures here, representing the light reflected in the water, this is something much more sketch-like. This is done on the spot, responding to the conditions of the moment. And in the process, we're kind of losing that definition of what everyone is wearing. That sort of documentary side of realism. So within a couple of years, he starts painting in this style in earnest, because he can see that this is a new mode that is itself very interesting. That the idea of rooting a painting in a response to what you're looking at in the moment, trying to kind of discard academic training and painting these incredibly detailed, illusionistic finished scenes in favor of responding to ephemeral light effects. Like, what is the light like that day? What are the ripples in the water? So you get all of those ephemeral effects, and you don't get the kind of history and the references to the Renaissance and everything that you had before. So that's really what we mean by Impressionism, a movement that is responding to modernity, engaging with modernity, but also trying to register usually ephemeral light and weather effects. Painting that looks spontaneous because it's done, or it seems to be done, or it's supposed to look like it's been done on the spot, in front of the motif, in front of the subject. So this painting, Impression Sunrise, it actually represents the port of Le Havre. So that's the town on the Normandy coast where he's from. This is actually a kind of busy, somewhat industrial port. There are smokestacks there. There are lots of commercial boats. There's this fishing boat that we see right in the center. That's maybe a little more kind of poetic. But the reflection of the sunrise in the water and the shadow of that fishing boat are practically the only incidents we have in the painting. The painting doesn't seem to be telling a story or giving us a moral lesson or even giving us a lot of information. And for most people in the 19th century, a scene of a commercial port is not even a proper subject for a painting. But what we have are these calligraphic marks that Monet has put on the canvas, and we have this subtle play of light, the colors of the sunrise, the difficulty of differentiating the blue cranes and the blue commercial boats that are in the harbor that we just barely see against the sky or against the water. So it's tonally a very beautiful set of color plays for us. But for the time, it's not a finished painting. It's a sketch. It can't be taken entirely seriously as art. So it's exhibited for the first time at, not the Salon. The Impressionists don't even try to send paintings to the Salon anymore. They not only don't want to get rejected, but they decide they're going to come up with a new mode of exhibiting their art. So just the way you all are exhibiting your art in this online virtual art fair, this is something new. And for the Impressionists, they organized a group exhibition on their own. They found a space that they could use, and it was the space of the photographer Nadar's commercial studio. Very, very large commercial studio that he had actually taken over Gustave Le Gray's studio, very close to the Opera House that I showed you a moment ago. And this is a kind of up and coming, booming part of Paris where some of the new department stores are and everything. You have to picture, I don't know if you can see that just below the gable there and big windows, you see the signature of Nadar. That was actually lighted with gaslight, and it was glowing in red. So the signature Nadar was in red against this building facade. So this group exhibition, it's not a commercial success by any means, but it's a watershed event in the history of art because we see artists who decide we're going to break from the establishment and we're going to find a way to exhibit our art under our terms. And it should be noted too that the advent of having oil paint in tubes, which these have been around at this point for several decades, since the early 19th century, maybe the 1840s, they're more common. Having oil paint in tubes instead of animal bladders, which you see in the upper left here, this is like a little animal skin, kind of like a sausage, what you would put a sausage in, and it's just tied up or clamped together. It's very messy. You open it up and then it's imagine trying to paint outdoors if you had paint in these animal bladders, but having oil paint in tubes, it doesn't make painting out of doors easy. Painting out of doors is challenging, but certainly the portability of the tubes is helpful for impressionists who are painting out of doors like this. So here's Monet's Poppies from 1873, a scene of his wife and son in the foreground here, walking through a field of poppies. There's another woman and child in the background. And this painting doesn't have the kind of perspective that a Renaissance painting has. You know, Monet is using the same greens in the background and in the foreground. He is suggesting the recession into space by the way he handles the poppies. And to just show you that, I have a photograph here, just a modern color photograph of a field of poppies. So as we look at these poppies, and we picture Monet looking at a similar field of poppies with people walking through it, notice the poppies that are closest to us. You really see that cadmium red center of the poppy. And then you see the petals of the poppy that are a little more orange. You know, they're still red, but they're kind of orange red, cadmium orange. Start looking in the middle ground and looking in the background. When we get to the background, you're seeing a lot of orange and only some little dots of red. Now let's look at, Monet's painting again. You see how he has used dabs of red next to the dabs of orange. You see some of the, kind of the distribution of the petals, right? So this diagonal suggests recession into space. But it's, I think, also helpful to picture Monet not representing kind of the detail of every blade of grass and every flower, but instead giving this what is called, an impression, this simplification of the poppy that helps to create an atmosphere and also helps to unify the painting. Are there any questions? I saw a little, I don't know, like someone had written something. It kind of came on my screen.
So one person asked, is it common for artists to display their signatures on public buildings back then?
No. That was very bold on Nadar's part. I will say that one other realist artist who comes just before Manet is Courbet, and Courbet often signed in red. I mean, he painted a lot of landscapes and kind of rural scenes, and he would often sign in red, kind of against the green of the foreground. Monet's signature is also fairly large here. In terms of buildings, I mean, it's normal for businesses to be named after people. Like you didn't just open a store and call it, Saint Lazare, department stores, and you generally called it the founder of the store, so-and-so's general store, so-and-so's grocery store. So having a name is not unusual on a building, but Nadar actually hired a special artisan to create that lit up signature. So it's really a sign of his kind of entrepreneurial side. And Nadar is a genius for publicity. I mean, Nadar practically invents celebrity culture. He photographs some of the most famous actors and singers of the time, and he displays those photographs in his shop windows so that you, the ordinary person walking down the street, like, wow, he photographed Sarah Bernhardt, I want him to photograph me too. And he even tried to kind of make ordinary people look more like artists and celebrities in the way he lighted them and, you know, dressed them and everything. So we have this kind of emerging celebrity culture, kind of in and around photography, and also really his name on that building is kind of a sign of that.
It's really interesting. And
Go ahead.
Yeah, he also asked, does painting with tubes make it easier for Impressionist artists to paint? Maybe because it has a larger capacity?
Yes, I mean, capacity is good. If you're Van Gogh, for instance, Van Gogh really put a lot of paint on a given canvas. So it depends on the artist's kind of way of working. I mean, an artist like Monet might have a blue on his palette and actually paint more than one part of the scene that used the blue, but some artists work more, like Cezanne works more sort of patch to patch and isn't just saying, okay, I've got my blue, now I'm going to put a little over here, a little over there, because I already got it on my palette, I better use it up. You know, but Monet, I mean, when you see the blue that he's got in this smoke here, right in the center, I mean, I imagine that he mixed up that blue and, you know, went through quite a bit of it there. So capacity, yeah, that helps, but just being able to squeeze out the little bit that you need and then put the cap back on. Because if you're painting outdoors, you know, you're dealing with wind, you're dealing with changing light, you're dealing with, you know, people and animals, you know, you're getting hot, the light is too bright, you need a parasol, you need to turn your canvas around because the sun moves, you know, all kinds of things. But the point for the Impressionist painting is to look like it was done on the scene. And so as we move forward with Monet's art, I mean, here we're looking at this painting of this train station, the Gare Saint-Lazare, and he actually does a whole series of those. And you know, he early on starts kind of painting the same subject at different times of day and under different conditions, you know, kind of different weather conditions. And that becomes a sort of Impressionist strategy, really. Like, you're not only focusing on light effects or weather effects just for their own sake, but you might create a gallery exhibition where all the paintings in the show are the same subject but handled, you know, at different times of day. And it gives your exhibition a kind of unity that it didn't have if it were just a train and then a haystack and, you know, garden scene and everything. So you know, here we are looking at this other train station, and again, I want you to kind of think in terms of understanding, why is this shocking? It looks totally straightforward to us. Well, we're used to sort of snapshots and spontaneity, and, you know, we're used to abstraction in art, we're used to lots of things, but these things are all very, very new at this moment. You know, even train stations are not very old yet. And so for the train station is a big disruptor in the 19th century. And so people are often trying to tell stories around train stations, arrivals and departures, and, you know, families and journeys, and, you know, people going on a religious pilgrimage, or people going to see grandma, or whatever, you know, like they want a story around the train. And Monet is not focusing on, he's not giving us a story. You know, he's showing the trains coming and going just like the weather is changing. So, and we like to compare Impressionist paintings with photography, and I think that it's certainly worth thinking about what's going on in photography at the time. But we don't have this kind of abstraction in photography. We don't have this kind of painterliness, dots of paint that show the faces of these people waiting for the train at left, or this kind of tracery of blue-green in front of this locomotive. This, these puffs of steam and the kind of the fog of Paris in the middle of the painting. I mean, there are no photographs that can capture this kind of movement, this kind of spontaneity yet. Photographs are still black and white. They're still long exposures for the most part. I mean, this is one of a whole series of photographs of train stations from Paris to Normandy, from Paris to Boulogne, the Gare d'Amiens, the train station in Amiens, photographed by a great photographer, Valdus. But he's used a long exposure to try to get some light into those train sheds so that we can kind of see into the sheds a little bit. This long exposure means that if someone was walking down in front of us, they're not captured at all in the photograph. So the train station looks oddly desolate. The sky is completely white. We don't see clouds or anything because he's used such a long exposure. So while photography does introduce kind of certain, an ability to create an image that's divorced from tradition and, Renaissance art and the academy, and, to kind of look at this as an abstract pattern. That's a way in which photography is interesting for painting in the 19th century. But at the same time, a photograph in 1855 is not giving us, the kind of, the abstraction of smoke around the train station, that Monet is going for in these oil paintings that are brilliantly sketch-like. I want to kind of move on a little bit from Monet and just show you a few more Impressionist painters, and I think I'm not going to have time to get through everything I wanted to. But again, Renoir we think of as a very, kind of almost saccharine kind of artist, but I wanted to bring out the fact that really in his time, these paintings are very controversial and they're very difficult for people. So while this looks like a very happy scene, a place where you really, like if you're a teenager and you wanted to go there with your friends, and if the only image your parents had of Le Moulin de la Galette was this painting, that, oh sure honey, you can, you're going with your friends, oh great. Really, when Toulouse-Lautrec paints Moulin de la Galette about 10 years later, it's maybe a place that your parents wouldn't want you to go. But anyway, look at the sunlight that's streaming through the trees and, creating these patches of light on the back of the man with his back to us, or on the dresses of the two women facing us, or the blue shadows that are around this dancing couple at left. It's like everything in the painting is kind of made of light, made of the kind of momentariness of light. Well, we think this is very lovely, But in the 19th century, people are still wedded to this idea that, you know, man is made in God's image. You know, to show a human figure who seems to be atomized, who seems to be kind of like made up of light particles, instead of being this solid person, is an affront. You know, it's really difficult for people to grapple with. And so, again, like this painting, The Swing, I mean, I'll read you a few pieces of criticism that this painting gets at the third Impressionist exhibition. Unfortunately, placed next to these pretty canvases is The Swing. In it, the effects of sunlight are combined in such a bizarre way that they exactly produce the effect of grease stains on the figure's clothing. Another person, the person who coins the term Impressionism, Louis Leroy, says, "More blue, but this one is frighteningly intense. It has been applied to the picture of a young girl on a swing covered with azure pom-poms. I hope you like pom-poms, for the painter has scattered them all over, in the sky, in the trees, and on the ground, and everywhere the same ferocious blue. This dizzying work was signed by Renoir." You know, another critic says, you know, he kind of creates a dialogue between a doctor and a person, and the doctor says, "Come on, let's go. The sight of these blue pom-poms is unhealthy." You know, again, we find it hard to imagine that a painting like this would be labeled unhealthy, you know, to look at. But that's how these paintings are initially received in 1877. The artist Pissarro is someone whose career is rather different from Monet's. He doesn't get the commercial success that Monet eventually gets in the 1880s and beyond. He kind of sticks more to some of the subjects that were in realism. You know, he sticks a little more to kind of agricultural life, small town life, and he kind of maintains that interest in documenting it, as Monet is starting to let go of that and, you know, kind of focus more on the abstraction of light effects. So this is a typical early painting, very rich, still in that kind of realist mode. And when he kind of borrows Monet's airier mode of painting, his more sketch-like mode of painting, he's initially doing paintings like these, which look a lot like Monet's poppies, let's say, but still he's a little more grounded. He's a little more kind of giving you the feel of this small town outside Paris. Or, you know, he includes a little more attention to labor, to industry in his art. You know, this figure who's carrying firewood on his back and making his way across this field. You know, the attention to light is very similar to Monet. The shadows of these poplar trees that are falling against the landscape here, that these beautiful blue shadows across the painting, while there are still these dabs of white as you've got this frost on the ground. But Monet never gives us a figure as solid as this man carrying the firewood. And in his very late work from the 1890s, he kind of adapts Monet's series to do series of his own. But in many cases, they have, again, more attention to everyday life. You know, we're looking down from a hotel balcony onto this busy square, not far from the Opera House in Paris, the square in front of the National Theatre in Paris. and you see the omnibus, and you see the, you know, people walking to a kiosk and buying a newspaper. So it's still, it has in common with Impressionism this interest in modernity and ephemeral light and weather effects. But he kind of keeps hold of a documentary side of art that some of the others let go of more. Degas, who is much more wedded to the idea of being kind of a history painter for a longer time. So he's, again, more invested in the figure than someone like Monet or Pissarro, both of whom are more oriented toward landscape. So this is a great example of Degas' Impressionist work, Place de la Concorde, the Viscount Lepic and his daughters. As in Monet's early painting, we get real definition of the figures and kind of what they're wearing. You see this really adventuresome composition, though, a composition that looks like a photograph, you know, because the man on the left is kind of cut off by the side of the painting, and the main subject, the Viscount Lepic, is kind of heading this way, and man is looking toward him. The daughters are kind of heading one way, and the Viscount is heading the other way. Most of the center of the painting is empty. So what is he getting at here? Actually, there seems to be a kind of political disagreement here, that the Viscount Lepic is actually a very conservative guy politically. He's a Bonapartist. He's still, you know, he supported the first Napoleon, and of course the second, Napoleon III, had been emperor up until 5 years before this painting. And the man at left, I don't know if you can see this very well, but he's got this, instead of just a tie, he has this kind of big bow that's red, white, and blue. And this sort of festoon of ribbons is a very pro-republic kind of ornament. And so it's you know, sort of like you're in one political party and you see someone wearing a T-shirt that says, you know, anyway. So it looks like this well-to-do conservative man is actually avoiding running into someone he knows because he's got this pro-republic political display on. But anyway, as a painting, it's impressionist because it seems to be concerned with ephemerality, you know, a big city square with people going in different directions, and you know, not afraid to cut off the composition in unusual ways. And this is before photographs that do this are very common. But it's more carefully drawn than a Monet. You know, Degas is more interested in kind of capturing characteristic poses and gestures of modernity than the other impressionists, like this absinthe drinker, this woman in a cafe. And he, in many ways, turns to the subjects of the ballet and the racetrack because he is looking to make a complicated history painting. You know, he wants to do, obviously, a scene of modernity, but a history painting used to have a lot of figures in motion. And so a ballet rehearsal has lots of figures in motion, which is a difficult thing to create a painting with. So he does that, but he gravitates toward the ballet because it's something modern, even as it captures this sort of essential characteristic of old-fashioned history paintings. And in his later years, he does many, many pastels, including pastels of women at their toilette. Again, very unusual vantage points, compositions, intense close-ups in some cases. And I wanted to show you just two other artists very briefly. And the first artist of these two is named Berthe Morisot. And we see her, this is not her painting, this is Manet's painting, but she is posing at the balcony, with holding a fan right up to the railing there. She is a friend of Manet's. In fact, she marries Manet's brother, and she poses in this Manet painting here. And then she's participating in many of the Impressionist exhibitions in the 1870s. So here's her balcony painting. And one thing that we have to keep in mind when we look at the work of women artists in the Impressionist movement is that for an upper-class woman like Berthe Morisot, it wouldn't have been proper for her to go to certain kinds of cafes where really like married women didn't go there, or upper class women didn't go there. It was maybe okay for Degas to go there and paint a prostitute, but it is not okay for a woman like Berthe Morisot. So as we look at the work of women artists and we see a mother and child, or two women in a boat here, we can talk about how this is an Impressionist painting and all that, but we have to kind of realize that this is a subject that is okay for a proper, married female artist, or unmarried, female artist, she's married at this point, to undertake, and not kind of expect the same attention to the bars, the cafes, the prostitution that we see in the work of people like Manet and Degas. Same with the work of the American artist who works extensively in France and is close friends with Degas, Mary Cassatt, who pays a lot of attention to indoor light effects in many of her paintings. She's fascinated by artificial light, and so the gas lights and the electric lights that are used in theater interiors. Electricity is new, and so that there's some electric light here and there in a painting from 1880, but you're mostly seeing gas lights or kind of oil lamps in these paintings. Gas lights in a theater like this. But two young women who are at the theater, and we get this amazing play of the gas lights on their fans, their dresses, their skin, and so you've got this kind of green and blue on their skin, as well as this play of green shadow on their white gloves and white dress. Very, very interesting Impressionist exploration of light. But again, the kind of subject that is acceptable for an upper class woman like Cassatt, to show a woman who's out for the evening, but she's not on the street. She's in a kind of acceptable environment. So I will leave it there, and I'll certainly take any more questions that you have.
Sorry, I muted myself. So there were a couple of questions in the chat, I believe. So wait, let me scroll up. Okay, so one person asked, Are celebrities often associated with artists back then? Maybe they collaborate together to make artworks?
There are models who are kind of preferred by some artists. In the case of female artists, we often have them painting certain siblings, because again, that's more sort of acceptable for them. But Manet paints his family members a lot, and he also paints Berthe Morisot a number of times. I mean, people in his social circle. In terms of celebrities, I mean, we don't see them appearing in high art, I mean, in paintings that much. Manet paints a few very famous opera singers and actors. Usually at that point, they're not, like one of them was kind of falling ill, and it was almost like a fundraiser for the actor. In another case, the actor, the singer was a big collector of Manet's work, and so it's more of a kind of society portrait for him to do the painting of Jean-Baptiste Faure as Hamlet. It's like he's this big opera singer posing as Hamlet. So there isn't the kind of association between celebrities and painters as there is, let's say, with Andy Warhol and some people who appear in his art and are also kind of celebrities outside that world. Because as I mentioned, the whole notion of celebrity is something that I think we can ascribe to an actor like Sarah Bernhardt, who hires a photographer to kind of photograph her, and who's increasingly just someone who's famous just for being who she is, in addition to the kind of quality of her performances. Did I answer that question? I mean, you don't see a lot of celebrities in Impressionist paintings, but you do see kind of familiar models, and you see the celebrity kind of emerging at this moment. Another question?
Let's see. Oh, so the next question is from Jane. Jane, do you wanna ask it yourself, or do you want me to ask?
So the environment is constantly changing. Perhaps the lighting and the weather, when like artists paint outside and outdoors, will it affect the quality of the artist's art?
Absolutely. Monet sometimes, he found out that he was painting some poplar trees and that there was a woodcutter who was going to be chopping them down and, like selling the wood. And Monet actually purchased the trees from the woodcutter so that he could keep working on his series of paintings. Because Monet would work, especially when we get to the series of the 1880s, like the Rouen Cathedral, or I guess that's the best example that I have here. And there's a really narrow window of 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, but really more like 15 minutes, where the light is exactly like this painting. And he was working on 24 Rouen Cathedral paintings. And so he would take along several canvases. When he's working on the river, on the Seine, like looking at poplar trees, he actually had a studio boat, and he would kind of slide the canvas that is the, let's say, 6 a.m. motif, and then put it aside. It's like, okay, the light's changing now, it's time for the next one. And so he would work on these canvases at the same time of day, but over many days, because these paintings have many layers. Impressionist paintings, in the early 1870s start out looking very spontaneous and sketch-like. But by the time we get to these series of the 80s and 90s like this, the paintings are much more encrusted and have more layers. And so Monet would have to work on it for this narrow window, you know, many different days when the light was decent, you know, like you have a really cloudy day, you can't work on this painting. This is the full sun kind of motif. So it's very challenging to paint out of doors. I mean, the biggest challenge is, you know, just the wind and your easel, and then the not just the changing light, but the light being in your eyes or the light being on the canvas. You know, you want to be able to see the canvas, so you have to have some kind of protective umbrella, some kind of, you know, tent-like thing that, you know, to shade your canvas, or else, you know, if you're working on a cloudy day, that's easier. But it is very challenging.
Thank you, Professor Locke. My question has been answered. Thank you.
Yes.
Let me see. So our last question is from Henry, and he wants to ask, what do you think affected you most from your adolescent years that contributed to your success? Also, it's actually not related to artwork. It's more about...
Well, that's interesting. When I was in high school, I really wanted to study journalism. I was the editor of my high school newspaper, and I really liked interviewing people and doing research and writing news stories and feature stories, and I liked editing, you know, my peers' news stories, which of course now I do a lot of that because I have to grade a lot of papers. And I had never heard of art history. You know, I had maybe been to the St. Louis, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I had been to the St. Louis Art Museum once. You know, I mostly came into contact with the world of kind of high art and culture through playing the piano and having a little knowledge of classical music. But my parents didn't really know much about art or go to museums. And so my first semester of college, I took an art history class and just thought, wow, this is, I like this. And I found that art history, the thing that really fascinated me about it was that, you know, here were these objects that somehow told a story about the time, you know, that they kind of bore an imprint of this moment in history. I mean, you could go to the Gare Saint-Lazare, and if you're not Monet, or if it's not 1877, you're going to create a very different kind of work of art. I mean, Monet himself, if he had done another Gare Saint-Lazare series in 1887, it would have looked different from this. And so I was fascinated that all of the kind of research and the synthesis of kind of information and ideas that interested me in journalism could go into art history. So I think kind of the work that I did in high school on the newspaper did kind of set me up for being interested in art history. And I got, you know, I was lucky in that I got into you know, all the graduate programs that I applied to, you know, anyway, so I was able to kind of do well with art history. But anyway, it is interesting to kind of look back on, you know, where do these interests start with? I mean, my mother really thought very highly of French culture. you know, we had some picture books and postcards and things of a few Impressionist paintings. And I was able to go on an exchange trip to France when I was a high school student. And, you know, I studied French in high school, and that also really had a major impact on my later discovery of art history and my love of art history. So I guess my advice would be, you know, whatever you're interested in art, you're interested in technology, virtual reality, you know, just keep making things, keep doing what you're doing. You know, don't wait for inspiration, or, you know, wait for someone else to tell you, oh, you know, you should make a film or something. You want to make a film, start making a film. Make a very simple film. Make a really dorky film, but just so you find out, well, what's it like to make a film just with my iPhone and, you know, my dog or something, you know, then you can make a film that's more avant-garde after you've made a really dorky film because you want to make a film. So just keep kind of applying yourself to the things that you are drawn to, and pretty soon you'll, you know, one thing will lead to another, and you'll be making some great discoveries. I really enjoyed it, and all the best with the art fair. In fact, please send me the link so that I can see what all of you are producing. Thank you so much.